For 5 decades, the environmental movement has had a monomaniacal focus on climate change, to the exclusion of everything else. That has damaged public discourse, distorted policy making, and diverted research funds from critical causes. We changed that on our side, and that is why we propose. A few points to set up. Firstly, what is the 9 planetary boundaries framework? This neglected framework ascribes limits to our actions on the ecosystem, involving a set of 9 guidelines for us to abide by. Namely, climate change, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, nitrogen and phosphorus flows, global freshwater use, land system change, the erosion of biosphere integrity, chemical pollution, and atmospheric aerosol loading. Secondly, we envision this framework being used in 3 areas. 1. In media coverage and public discourse, alongside the incessant drumbeat of headlines about the Paris Climate Agreement, we will likely see the 8 other planetary boundaries being featured as well. 2. When policymakers both internationally and domestically discuss these issues, they will treat all 9 issues with greater seriousness than we currently do. This translates into more local laws to address these issues, accompanied by international accords. 3. Academic funding will be diversified. Instead of just going into cutting-edge carbon sequestration technology, we will also develop, say, slow-release fertilizers that are less likely to leach chemicals into water sources. To be clear, we still think climate change will receive somewhat disproportionate attention given its global impacts, but the current hyperfixation on climate change has come at the expense of other goals. For instance, the Kariba Dam, despite providing clean energy, has more than half the flow of water downstream and drowns thousands of animals. Our stance is that given these inevitable trade-offs, we should balance the focus on climate change with other concerns. Thirdly, what are current projections for climate change? The current consensus seems to be that the worst case scenario is 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the next century, and that is if we do absolutely nothing. But a lot of work's already being done. With climate agreements and green technology, warming will probably be capped around 2 degrees Celsius, which most of us will survive. In the meantime, the frequency of cold waves, which kill 10 times more people than heat waves, will drop dramatically, saving millions of lives. But before I go on, sure.
The reason why we're able to get the green technology that you yourself want to say is because we pivot resources to one sector, making it more effective in the arts and house, whereas you reduce the chance of it succeeding when you spread it across 9.
That's not true. That concedes that for the 8 other issues, we need more attention on them in order to solve these issues. We prove from our side of the house, when you diversify this attention, it means more of every single existential threat being resolved. In the meantime, going back to my case, crop use around the world will more than double due to an earlier warm season. For those in the developing world, the availability of food can mean the difference between survival and starvation. So you'll not only be false, but unstrategic for Op to claim climate change is as catastrophic as it seems. We have 3 arguments from proposition. Firstly, that we better address diversity in environmental issues. Secondly, that we build stronger consensus around environmental protection. And thirdly, that we protect vulnerable communities. First argument on better addressing diversity in environmental issues. The premise of this argument is that we are tackling climate change in a vastly unstrategic and dangerous way that threatens our environment. As we speak, there are 34 new hydropower dams under construction on the Mekong River. Never mind that thousands of acres of forested land will be inundated in the process. And never mind that they block migration paths for millions of fish every year. And never mind that they dramatically reduce water flow downstream, where entire towns rely on the Mekong's flooding to cultivate rice paddies. In response to their PUI, if they want to solely focus on that, that is what they get on their side. The reason why it takes place without the 9 PBs framework is because climate change is the only priority. Yes?
Don't you think there's going to be political backlash if you build dams in this horrible way that you yourself want to say?
The problem here is that because we are only focusing on climate change, we ignore the impacts on other people's lives and other issues. That is why in the status quo, many dams are being built. So because of that, you have to stand for a world where these people's genuine concerns are neglected on your side. All other environmental harms can be written off, purely in favor of reducing carbon emissions. Back to my case. On their side of the house, they justify hurting the environment in unconscionable ways. Therefore, in the place of a climate disaster, we have instead created a bona fide environmental catastrophe for the most vulnerable in the most destitute areas. Pollution, leading to 9 million premature deaths, is inexcusable. The extinction of keystone species, like honeybees, like upsetting ecosystems, puts us in immediate danger. We need to find a better balance between climate change and these other 8 existential threats as well. The way we achieve this on proposition is rather straightforward. Firstly, when all 9 issues receive more equal media coverage, more people know about these neglected areas because they are plastered all over the headlines. We uniquely shift the attention, no thank you, of people who are already committed to climate protection. So obviously, the problem with some of these environmental issues, like the ongoing water crisis, is not that no one cares, is that no one knows. Because the singular focus on emissions has largely blinded the majority of the public to other problems in response to the POI. But secondly, this may not save the world instantly, but at the very least, it is better than nothing at all. If more people are at the very least concerned, politicians are more incentivized to bring them up to capture support. That means more bills proposed, more solutions discussed, and more policies passed on our side of the House. Second argument, that we build stronger, no thank you, and more durable consensus around environmental protection. Locally, the problem with environmental issues, being lumped in with climate change, is that there's a wall of unthinking partisan hostility towards anything to do with the environment because of its current association with climate change. This looks like the poor, who view renewable energy initiatives as preoccupations of the navel-gazing elite that only drive up the price of coal in winter. It looks like representatives of rural districts who associate climate change with increased tax and unwanted government interference. Even if they want to talk about these issues, people do not care because they associate it with this form of climate change. On our side of the House, we localize and disaggregate the environmental movement into 9 aspects, thus broadening its base or support. When people in a rural district in Virginia turned on their taps to see undrinkable water flowing out due to fracking, that was an opportunity to rope them in. But that never happened. Because all we wanted to talk about was carbon emissions, which are both abstract and polarizing. By addressing the environment based on individual aspects that make a concrete difference in our lives, we can bring opposition groups together into the coalition of support for climate issues. On the level of international discourse, the current problem with climate change is twofold. Firstly, that rich countries who pollute the most shun their responsibility to cut on emissions by accusing developing nations of not doing their fair share. But secondly, developing countries characterize efforts to make them cut emissions as unfair neo-colonialist ploys. When we can talk about other things on our side of the House, the excuses for both of these sides go away. Developing countries can no longer hand-wave away environmental efforts because things like deforestation are localized issues only they can solve, and that rich countries in the past did not cause. Similarly, developed countries can no longer use developing nations' inaction as a justification for theirs. They need to act in areas which they can, since everyone else is doing the same. So on our side of the House, when the 9 PB's framework dominates discourse, countries now gravitate towards their natural advantage in saving the environment because they have no more excuse to do so. For example, because developed nations emit the most, they may cut the most. And in a similar vein, because LDCs suffer the most from localized environmental crises, they may focus more on that. Inherently, this is more equitable and gets everyone on board. But more importantly, there are 9 existential threats that we face and we need to address everyone. Our case is simple. The 9 planetary boundaries free us from the chains of inaction. We're very proud to stand on prop.
Can I check if I'm audible? Yep. When PROP's main framework on the fight against climate change is a flawed, fractionalized goal based off of faulty calculations, you fail to garner the public's attention, you fail to gather political support, you fail to generate actionable policies, very proud to oppose. 3 things I'll do in my speech. Number 1, set up. Number 2, a few refutations to PROP's case. And number 3, I'll forward 2 argument in today's debate. Firstly, set up. What does using the 9 planetary boundaries actually look like? It looks like we believe that using these 9 it means incorporating these boundaries into international policy making regarding to climate change and the goals for climate change activism. Secondly, what is opposition's stance in this debate? We also support the fight against climate change, and we believe that on our side, we have decentralized policy making. Countries are able to decide on their own what agendas they see fit to solve climate change issues and issues in their local area. The burden on our side is not to prove that we solve climate change better, but we prove that we have incentivized more change. And the metric in today's debate, we believe, is twofold. Number one, deliverables. Who delivers better policy, better actionable policy making in terms of how accurate it is, how quickly, how timely it can be implemented, and whether it can be implemented at all. And number two, political traction. Which paradigm garners more political support from the people, from the government, and from international countries? A few refutations. Number one, they say that they would want to spread resources and capital across 9 frameworks. Well, we believe that right now we have limited capital, limited resources. By spreading it out more, you spread it out more thinly. You won't be able to have all the technology they claim, and all the technology in the past, for example, carbon capture and sequester, would not be able to be developed further in the future because now these resources are spread into less urgent things which they claim they want to do. Number two, the point about Mekong Dam and all the things they say that the side effects it can cause. Well, as my second speaker has already POI'd, we believe that this will cause political backlash. It's politically unfavorable because if the impacts are really as bad as they claim, it would lead to government would probably want to choose different ways. They want to research better methods in order to build dams, in order to have better solving climate change while also not destroying people around them. Because of course there's going to be protests. There's not just going to be flooding with no impacts at all. Third point of refutations. They say that people don't know the side effects of building dams or whatnot, and that the only way they know about these things is through 9 planetary frameworks. Excuse me, if you say that the impacts are really that large, of course people would know about it. You don't need us to plaster 9 planetary frameworks right in their face for them to know about it. A few arguments in today's debate. Number one, how the 9 planetary framework relies on faulty calculations. 3 parts to this argument. Number one, level 1, the framework has proven to be ineffective, and in the status quo, we have already surpassed and crossed 6 of the 9 boundaries. For example, in the boundary of climate change, CO2 in the atmosphere is said to be limited at 350 parts per million, but right now we're at 412. We believe that people would become complacent because of this. Why? 2 reasons. Number one, they would see that they've already reached the point of no return. And number 2, they would lose faith because after surpassing these boundaries, the scientists claim that the world is going to end. We're going down a slope which has no return. But right now, well, the world is not ending. Second layer to my argument, why is the framework in of itself inaccurate? We believe that the calculation itself is based on incomplete technological findings. This is why things such as novel entities and atmospheric aerosol loading are both still not quantified. Third layer, what is the impact of having inaccurate data? We believe that this leads to the framework not being able to translate to real tangible policies. For example, how much carbon emission can a country have? How much land can be used for agriculture? These are questions side proposition cannot answer because of their inaccurate framework. Second reason, we believe that there will be less legitimacy for environmentalism because there will be likely going to be more pushback from the right and the conservative because now it can be weaponized. It makes it far harder to get concessions in politics because the left now seems far weaker because of the ideology. It's no longer based on scientific research, it's based on false information. Second argument about how we better streamline policy making. 3 structural reasons. First level, 3 structural reasons why we get more political support on our side. Number 1, it's easier to get political support when the goals are not fractionalized. When it's fractionalized, it's much harder to market it. It's not as marketable to the average Joe because it diverts attention and it makes it look like there's much less impact overall because now there's 9 different goals to focus on rather than having one single goal. Secondly, more political backlash. It will cause more political backlash from people on the ground because policies now don't target people's immediate need. For example, the government of Laos, a landlocked country, would be forced to take on things such as reducing ocean acidification, although they're landlocked. They would be forced to do these things over than reducing haze or reducing forest fires because these 9 planetary boundaries forces countries to sacrifice personal goals to align with international ones. It sacrifices the benefits of people on the ground and leads to political backlash. Therefore, in Prop's best case, where an environmentally friendly government can be elected into power, we believe that the 9 planetary boundaries exacerbates political short-termism because now the 9 planetary boundaries forces the government to pass environmental policies that may not favor the people's immediate needs. This means that the government would be voted out, and then the impact, or for example, the policies that have passed would just be shot down in the next term. And this harm only exists on prop. Number 3, international political deadlock. Different countries have divergent incentives depending on geographical locale. For example, Indonesia may focus on pollution. Maldives and Singapore may focus on preventing sea level rise. And on proposition, you're forcing this 9 boundary frameworks on them. And therefore, it's harder to enact cohesive change because you're now forced to do policies rather than getting to choose what they want to do. But before I move on, I'll accept the POI.
So, by your logic, would you support the use of the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, we believe that, sure, that's one part, but I don't see how that truly relates to the 9 planetary roles. So, moving on to my argument, level 2. Why is individual agenda for countries comparatively more efficient? Firstly, it focuses on voters' immediate needs because it taps into people's emotions in order to receive votes for continuous political support for green policy. The importance of this is that climate change is often seen as a post-materialistic goal, something government deprioritize because they value issues like social welfare more. In order to ensure continuous support, we need to get voters what they want. We need to deal with the climate change issues which directly impact the people. Secondly, countries have already pledged to combat climate change in international meetings and summits in the status quo. Why is this exclusive on our side, and why would this not continue on their side? We believe that right now countries are self-selected into these types of institutions, and they can bring up their own policies. They can do their own things which they believe would help the climate but would also benefit them locally. Something which is exclusive to side opposition and not side proposition. Level 3, what's the impact of this? We are able to consolidate democratic support which leads to better legislation to combat these issues. It leads to more political buy-in to focus on environmental issues, and therefore we better achieve the fight against climate change. Therefore we should win this debate. I'm very proud to oppose.
When they say they stand for the 17 Sustainable Development and Goals, this was a concession. Because even though poverty is a very important issue to solve, we recognize that we need to divert attention also towards other areas that are important, for example, literacy, for example, gender equality. This is why we prefer the 9 planetary boundaries framework on our side, because even though climate change is important, it is also important to talk about other things. With that, 2 issues in the speech. First on climate change, second on the 8 other planetary boundaries. I'm going to spend less time on climate change because they don't even feel the burden on the opposition. If they want to divert so much attention there, they need to tell us why climate change is so devastating, even though we gave you countless of preemptions in first speaker as to why perhaps it's not as catastrophic as they want to talk about. Firstly, why is climate change probably not an existential threat? And I have 4 responses here that directly take down that case. 1, the consensus amongst climate scientists is that the worst scenario is 4 degrees of warming, and that's if we do nothing. But given that we're doing quite a bit, I think that's quite okay. Especially considering how green technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. But 2, in the meantime, crop yields around the world will more than double due to an earlier warm season. So for those in the developing nations, the availability of food can mean the difference between survival and starvation. It will not only be false, but unstrategic to claim, no thank you, it is very existential. But third, it is simply not true, because floods and chemical pollution kill significantly faster than heat. Climate change may potentially be a future existential threat to many in developed countries, but for the vast majority of people in developing nations, they need to deal with the daily existential threat of dying from drinking poisonous water or losing their sources of food. But four, empirically, 10 times more people are likely to die from the cold than from the heat. So warming between 2000 and 2019 saved 3.1 million lives from cold-related deaths at the expense of just 130,000 extra deaths caused by heat. So as a result, global warming saved a net of nearly 3 million lives during the past 20 years. That's why climate change isn't even the issue we ought to prioritize in today's debate. But let's talk about the second argument, and they claim they were more efficient. One, they say they could tap into emotion without properly proving to us, one, why this is true on their side, but second, why we can't do the same. In fact, I would say we tap into emotion far better, because for those who currently are most heavily affected by water pollution, no thank you, you tap into their emotions by talking about the problems they face, not a abstract concept of climate change that they don't necessarily face. But then they say, when you can now pledge to do your own issues and resolve your own environmental problems. That's literally what our side does, because when you tell these countries that you don't just have to focus on climate change, you can focus on these 8 other issues, that's when countries can specialize and talk about the own issues that they're facing to solve it better. I want you to contrast this with the second argument that we bring to you that got minimal response. We told you that their side is a side where political gridlock currently exists because you are currently seen as imposing an unfair view on a vast majority of these countries. So what this substantive proves to you is that if you want to solve climate change, you need to adopt our framework, because it's only on our side, as our second substantive shows, that people who are most devoted to solving, who are best able to solve climate change are now going to solve it, because it seems hypocritical if other less developing countries are solving their own environmental issues, but the developed countries who are best able to solve climate change isn't doing anything. That's on the first clash. Second clash then, on the 8 other equally important boundaries. I want to now deal with the first argument on faulty metrics. I want to deal with the second layer first though, because it's less explained. Next, they basically say that you're ultimately going to be complacent and you're going to lose hope. But what we've seen in the past, when we thought that we went above the boundary for ozone, is that we managed to save it because we dedicated more attention to it. So if anything, this shows that if we dedicate sufficient attention, we can do it. That's why the comparative is more likely to be one of hope, where you know that you can solve these problems that are currently existing. But I just want to contest how faulty these numerical limits really are, because environmental scientists study far more than both sides in this debate really do, and do far more research. But note, if they want to talk about climate change, why don't these similar problems apply? Why don't the problems of carbon emissions and how you measure them similarly apply on their side? So I'm not sure why this is true. But just because something cannot be quantified properly doesn't mean it's not important. We cannot quantify how much happiness we are feeling in this room, but it doesn't mean that happiness is important, therefore this is not true. But I just want to note, even if it is faulty, what it means is that we better achieve more accurate versions of these goals on our side when we devote more attention to it. Before I move on, I'll take the POI.
The reason why this matters, and information and accuracy matters, is because you need to justify to your constituency that your policy will have...
We agree, these information do matter. The problem is that they're already quite accurate on our side. It's true that maybe it's not 100% accurate, but given that they've devoted countless of research and hours on it, we think they're going to be accurate majority of the time. They also say that the left is far likely to seem more weak, but our second argument flips this, when you are better able to devote your attention to things that people care about. They say backlash happens because you do things that don't help them. But on our side, that you protect the environment in ways that help these countries when you specialize on the issues that they face the most. If countries focusing on one boundary means the specialization of countries fixing what's most important to them, then we think we achieve the change far quicker, and that's fine. But in fact, we think complacency in this way is unlikely, because given the pressing need to fix the other boundaries, the completion of one is far more likely to give hope than to cause harm. No thank you. Our first argument proved to you that we better address diversity policy in these issues? The response that we get is one of political backlash. Here are 3 reasons to flip that. 1, because it is usually not enough when the most hurt are the most vulnerable who currently don't have sufficient political ground, especially if the indigenous community is relying on river, further explained in my argument. Second, backlash is not currently enough because the environmental movement, which is focused on climate change, doesn't care and actively chooses to pass climate policies, no thank you, at the expense of these other goals. Third, we get more backlash, as I will explain in my argument. But before I move on, sure.
All these data you give, for example, flooding, killing thousands of people, storms, famines, having drought in all these countries, they all fall under climate change. So why
Thank
not
you. Basically, they're saying that some problems are caused by climate change. If we solve climate change, we solve everything. Now, maybe that's true, but it's far better if we directly target those issues themselves, because we can solve it more quickly. It means less people die of floods when there's more technology to do so. Moving on to my third argument then, on protecting vulnerable communities. Now, we know that solving climate change comes with trade-offs of the 8 other planetary boundaries, yet what we don't talk about is the fact that these communities are also traded off. So for the 20,000 indigenous people living in the shadow of the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil, their voices were drowned out when they were forced to relocate from ancestral lands to make way for hydropower plants. So I want to note, opposition's silver bullet of political backlash is not an available option for the vast majority of these groups. They had no way to resist because they were told that the only way to save the world from burning up is to shunt them off their ancestral land, and many groups are overshadowed by excessive lobbying on reducing carbon emissions, and they suffer the same fate. The 9 planetary boundary system allows the social cost of these groups to be finally weighed more fairly for 2 reasons. 1, they are brought into focus when more localized aspects of the environment are part of the discussion. Local communities are given the chance to speak out. 2, then these previously alienated groups now become more important in environmental discourse because when people discuss those 8 other planetary boundaries in politics, they have a chance to share their lived experiences and their struggles because they're now brought to the forefront. This means a few things. 1, it means reduce alienation of these groups with regards to environmental issues, giving them a fighting chance when it comes to seeking justice for themselves and the environment, directly complementing our second argument. But 2, it also means more specific and effective solutions for the environmental problems that we face now, given that more groups ultimately have more intimate knowledge they're able to share on our side. So to solve the problem of chemical pollution of water bodies, we need to consult these communities to know how to solve it best. The 9 planetary boundary frameworks free us from the chains of inaction I'm happy to propose.
The 9 planetary framework on the side of government leads to the degradation of international cooperation. It undercuts and undermines efforts for environmentalism as a whole and condemns humanity to a futile future. Oppose. 4 sections of refutation before I go on to my extension about how we get better enforcement under our paradigm. Firstly, let's deal with the claim on diversity being addressed from theirs at the House in 2 key ways. 1, they say that dams are currently being built in horrible places in our paradigm because we sacrifice certain things. 2 problems. 1, I don't think the governments are critically naive as side proposition wants to claim in today's debate, because there are natural incentives for governments to build these things well, because if you don't do so, there's likely to be political backlash, it's likely to be political suicide. So at the point in which individuals cannot utilize the roads, for instance, to be able to go to their work, to be able to go to the schools, there's likely to be incentive for governments to do it well, because if people protest, they can literally vote you out, which is why you're likely to be subjected to political short-termism. But secondly, I want to flip this claim, because I think it ultimately gets worse on side of proposition, because politicians are able to utilize the framework to justify their own wrongdoings at the end of the day. If politicians have malicious incentive to do things in their own self-interested way, it manifests in the worst ways and are theirs to the house, because they can say there are so many other boundaries that you need to care about, which is why you have to trade off this one boundary that you personally care about, which is why they're able to build dams in the worst ways under their paradigm. But the second thing they give us is this idea that there are neglected areas that are not accounted for in the status quo. 2 responses. 1, I think it's predicated on a pretty abuse abusive assumption from proposition, because individual countries already recognize these local issues within the status quo. Why? Because countries have local incentives to be able to do so. That's why countries like Australia care about ocean acidification, because they want to protect their coral reef, or countries like Costa Rica wanting to protect their entire forestry industry, want to protect their forests. So you don't need these boundaries in order for you to get all of the benefits they want to talk about, because local governments care about these type of problems, they care about these type of solutions. But the second response I want to make here is to this assertion that they say that people don't know that these issues exist and you have to trigger that. I would argue that this is factually endemically wrong as opposed to their own characterization, because if these issues are so endemic to individuals' life, the fact that you cannot have water and access to clean food and energy, that's why individuals are likely to be knowledgeable about these issues at the end of the day. An easy intuition pop is to look at issues like the Michigan Flint water crisis that existed in the past year, but we're able to have political support to be able to revert this into ours in the House, because we recognize that people are not dumb and people can make their own decisions. The second thing I want to refute is this idea on skepticism around climate change in two ways as well. Firstly, I'm going to deal with this premise of them saying that rural individuals don't get to address their own struggles. I think it's unclear as to why people on proposition care about all 9 boundaries under theirs in the House in today's debate. If anything, it likely gets worse under their paradigm, because developing countries cannot attain their goals. If developing countries have limited resources within the status quo, they have to prioritize certain things. They want to prioritize, for instance, their electricity industry, but you're not able to do that when the imposition of Western values under their side of the House is likely to say that you have to care about all of these other goals. If a country, for example, like Cambodia is landlocked, why do you need to care about atmospheric type of aerosol loading under their paradigm when it doesn't affect you? The problem with proposition is that they cannot force a country to make a decision that's literally against what they themselves stand for. But this is harmful for their case then, because this means skepticism around Western values is worse under theirs in the House, which means that you ultimately get less compliance in terms of the policy you're able to get. The second thing they tell us under this is that they cannot use developing countries narrative anymore into our paradigm. But I think the messaging gets stronger in the arts of the House with decentralized control, because you have to prioritize certain issues that is actually approximate to you. You have to make the trade-off, which is why you're able to tell those Western states, for instance, that this is a personal issue that you have to deal with, and you don't get to dictate what I have to do in the future. The response we got from DPM was that, well, you can talk about your own struggles, which means you're able to opt in. I think it is disingenuous to the current context we live in, because there is global type of corporation combinations that are helping in the status quo. We have things like the Kyoto Protocol or COP27, where individuals are able to come together, and these things all happen under the guise of climate change. They don't need to have all of these boundaries to have such a cooperation. Before I go on to my third refutation, I'll tell Gali take a point.
The Paris Agreement got countries to agree to settling amongst boundaries that they already were going to do domestically, and this agreement isn't even legally binding. So why exactly is climate change going to be miraculously solved on your side?
At least on the our side of the House, countries can prioritize issues that are actually approximate to them. But in their paradigm, when you literally force countries into caring about 8 other issues that they don't care about, it's unclear why they're able to get all of the benefit from side proposition. Thirdly, on the idea of accuracy data, I want to note at the top of this refutation that inaccurate information isn't something side proposition can trade off. It's not something you can deplete under theirs of the House. Why? Because every single form of policy making in the status quo needs to be based off of research and scientific founding. You need to have scientific backing for you to be able to pass this. How else do you think that congressmen in the status quo will be able to justify to other individuals and their own constituency that this is something, a policy that is good, if you don't have return on investment and guarantee in terms of information? The response we get from them was really glim. They say that the 19 SDGs exist within the status quo, but the reason why we're able to support those frameworks is because at least some information exists so we can predict what is going to happen in the future. The problem with this type of information is that it's not analogous, because things like novel entities or atmospheric aerosol loading is completely not quantified in the status quo, so you cannot make the prediction of what's going to happen in the future. You cannot make accurate policies. But the last thing we get from that is that idea that, oh, this boundary is already good when we POI'd their DPM. Their response was, oh, it's good already. But the problem with this claim is that it inherently contradicts what their prime minister said. Because if their prime minister said that this boundary is still in its infant stage, it's still being developed in the status quo, that is time expended and you're not able to focus on other issues at the end of the day. Before I go on to my last refutation, go.
So you claim that our boundaries are arbitrary and faulty. So what makes carbon emissions and all the measures of climate change miraculously far better on your
And
side?
that's the problem of your side. Because unless on our paradigm, we're able to pivot resources to a boundary that's going to actually work. But they have to debate this context in the real world, in the status quo. In the status quo, we already have research for climate change, which is why we're able to get all the scientific breakthroughs in terms of the technological development we're able to get. Whereas there's the how to pivot your resource in the wrong way at the end of the day. The last thing they tell us is this idea, as in DPM, that they're able to specialize in their set of house. But I think that they lose all of their benefits, right? If you're going to specialize already under the guise of the climate change, then you don't get to expand your parameter. You don't get to broaden your horizon. So you don't get all of the benefits they want to talk about in this speech. On to extension then. Why does the framework fail to enforce necessary progress under their set of house? 3 parts. 1, how will enforcement likely be done within the status quo? I think that in the status quo, regulatory bases are often done on decentralized control. What does this look like? This is like self-reporting of data and information you have. Local governments actively applying punishment to their own laws in the status quo. Why is this the case then? Why is this important? Because given there's 190 plus countries that exist within the status quo, no scientific instrument can miraculously account for all of this data. Therefore, local governments are the one who have to facilitate this process. But secondly, why is it problematic under their set of house when you force countries to care about boundaries they don't care about? Because countries will still prioritize issues that are the most approximate to them. This looks like in countries like Malaysia, they forge paperwork about countries' things like emissions, for instance, to accurate reports on deforestation. On the comparative, when countries are able to care about their own issues, they can enforce their own laws. So countries like Malaysia implemented the Environmental Quality Act that prohibits deforestation in the future because that's an issue that's actually proximate to them. That's an issue that people on the ground actually care about. But thirdly, why is enforcement in this debate incredibly important as a concept? Because taking proposition at their best ground, even if they have enough political support, as we've proven to you they don't, but even if they have political support to get policies passed, it doesn't matter if the policies are not correctly enforced on the ground. Because the harm on their side is that not only you waste time, but you actively waste resources on a solution that's not going to work. Whereas in our paradigm, we can pivot the same resources to solutions that are more sustainable. For all of these reasons, then, you must oppose.
Thanks, Speaker, for that fine speech. We would now like to invite the Honourable here.
In first speaker, their case was all about climate change needing all the attention and all countries coming together to solve only climate change. In second speaker, they suddenly say, no, this debate is about letting developing countries focus on one localized issue, not climate change. That is a shift. Either that means they lose climate change on their side or they lose on the 9 planetary boundaries. They need to pick one, my third speaker, but I suggest it's a bit too late given that 30 minutes. But I'm going to respond to this new push on developing countries anyway before I get into my clashes. First of all, this assumes a false version of status quo. That status quo is one where we're focusing on localized issues. That is not what it is. Status quo is when we have a hyperfixation on climate change. So the problem that we solve on our side is that we let people focus on these issues, not force issues upon them. But so they force developing countries to hyperfixate on their localized issues. That compromises climate action. Second of all, these issues are actually quite proximate to them. Many issues in the 9 PBs affect one country all at once. So for instance, their claim that ocean acidification affects only a few countries is not true. Because guess what? Oceans are transboundary. But they didn't say these things are localized issues that we need individual countries to pick a solution to. That is not true. A lot of these things are collective action issues that don't need localized attention but need international attention. So there was an example of Australia's example of ocean acidification. Guess what? The ocean doesn't just border Australia, it borders many countries. So we can't just have Australia itself choose all by itself to focus on it because it can't fix it all alone. We need multiple countries, we need international attention. We only get that with the 9 planetary boundaries framework. First question on accuracy before a second clash on effectiveness. First on accuracy. And their fundamental assumption here is that the calculation is based on incomplete findings. They give us 2 examples of this out of 9 planetary boundaries. They say, but atmospheric aerosol loading doesn't have a quantified boundary yet. Sure, if that is true, then we need to use the framework in order to continue research on this framework so we can find out where those boundaries lie. But actually, I think historic data displays very clear thresholds. For instance, past ice ages show a very clear threshold of CO2 concentration, so we can find out with more research on our side that is exclusive to us. But secondly, the premise of this argument ultimately is that if it is inaccurate, you cannot translate it into tangible policy. If I can take this down, then regardless of whether or not it is accurate, we prove that we get tangible policy regardless. They say information matters because you need to justify it to their constituency. So I just want to ask them a question. How do you explain the fact that the agreement in the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees Celsius, 1.6, 1.7, 1.8, whereas most climate science agrees 2.0 degrees Celsius? How do you justify the fact to your constituencies that oftentimes there is no hard limit for how much in carbon emissions that you can emit? All of this suggests that actually, even if it is not tangible, even if there's not a hard limit, you can act on it. So I'm going to give you an example of how you can act on it, because they say if you're not quantified, you absolutely cannot make a policy at all. Let me show you how. So I say, hey, atmospheric aerosol loading is pretty important and no one is paying enough attention to it. And the countries then make policies that limit the amount that can be added, or not even a hard amount. They just set taxes on how much companies can emit in the air. So their argument on faulty metrics is out of this debate. I don't want to hear it again. But if I move on to my second clash on effectiveness, yes.
So the problem with your side is that at the point in which you only focus on all of nine, you still haven't engaged with the reason that the resources are dispersed, and given limited political capital, you can't make the boundaries actually sound for making decisions.
I'm going to respond to that now. The first premise here is that there's very limited political capital in status quo. First of all, this is not true. In status quo, there's huge media attention on everything. There's a monomaniacal focus. I want you to ask yourself, do you think the issue right now is that not enough people know about climate change, or that people know but don't support it? Clearly, it is the latter. What this proves is that there's a lot of political capital that we can, in fact, divert because it is dominating all media attention. But their claim here, fundamentally, is that you need a lot of attention to solve it. I have 4 responses to that. First of all, our second argument flips this, where we tell you that the hyperfixation is actually polarizing, and on the international level, it means people push blame because it's a global issue. But second of all, this is not true. Climate technology will probably exist anyway, and the research will probably exist anyway, because there's a global demand for it, because the problem exists. So even if the attention is not as strong, the problem will solve it. The financial incentive drives that. But third of all, they don't tell you what the problem actually is, because I think a lot of this research and a lot of this climate technology already exists in status quo. And the fact that we can both give examples of it proves that it's already there. So the problem is not we need to come up with new climate technologies. The problem is these climate technologies, such as hydropower dams, are being used in extremely unstrategic and extremely dangerous ways. They haven't dealt with that. So we need to figure out a fair way to deploy them that only happens on our side. But first of all, really? And I just want to examine their comparative here, because they talk about things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Climate Agreement. I just want you to ask yourself how much has actually been done on that. Because if their claim is that they can solve climate change, I just really doubt that on face value.
Right.
So if it's given, in our worst case, that, say, attention is deadlock, the deadlock breaker is that we solve other catastrophic things, as Isaiah tells you. But the subterranean logic here is that, well, climate change is the most important thing, therefore it justifies this trade-off to dedicate the most time to it. Isaiah gives you multiple reasons why climate change isn't actually that catastrophic. And their shift in the second speaker probably suggests that they concede to this, so they lose their push on climate change, guys. That is not something they can stand for in this debate. Third speaker needs to resolve it, but it's a bit too late given that's already been half an hour. So, as we saw in the past, there's a lot of political capital that we can in fact divert, given the fact that we solved the ozone layer, even though we have the monomaniacal focus on climate change. But the problem is, in the past 50 years of human history, we have had one paltry example of the ozone layer, one success. What about things like groundwater contamination, like air pollution, like the loss of wildlife and biodiversity that means a mass extinction for all of us? Our comparative is that we get more incentives to solve all of these issues. They don't engage with that. So their push is that solving climate change is exclusive. We've taken that down and taken on the subterranean logic that is the most important. Their first speaker case is entirely out, and the second speaker's pivot does not save them in this instance. But they even try to give a line of mitigation. They say political backlash will fix these trade-offs. I'm sorry, where do you think political backlash comes from? Because I think people can only be angry about something if they know that something exists. So really, it's about who gets attention to the issue first before they get backlash. Sure, maybe they get some backlash on their side, but it is outweighed by the focus on climate change. That means you have to do this to stop climate change despite the trade-offs. Third of all, it assumes that people will care about these things, but some of the issues in the 9 planetary boundaries and some of their negative externalities do not immediately affect people. For instance, in dams, there's loss of biodiversity. Before that, yes.
carbon capture costs over $1,000 to capture 1 ton of carbon dioxide, much more expensive than an economically viable solution. If current climate change...
The reason why that is, and your comparative, is because the monomaniacal focus on climate change means you can justify the huge opportunity cost on spending on these things. We don't get that on our side. Third response, it assumes people will care, but some of these negative externalities do not immediately affect people. Like for instance, loss of biodiversity doesn't affect communities if they don't fish. Fourth of all, they say there's many other boundaries to care about, so you can shift the blame. But this is not true, because their comparative of saying that individual countries already recognize local issues is just not true. We told you a lot of these things are regional problems, they are collective action problems. That's the response to their shift, and they need to deal with that by the next speaker. They didn't claim in that speaker that they could solve the Flint water crisis, and that is their comparative. Guys, the Flint water crisis is still happening. That is their real comparative they have to deal with on their side. And what about the water crisis in Palestine, in Lebanon? They don't deal with all of those things. Lastly then, on deadlock, and I think this is out of this debate because they don't bring it up at all after their first speaker, their claim is just based on a false assumption that Laos will have to fix ocean acidification. But as we've proven, to be very clear, that is our comparative. So just to be clear, they're not defending what they need to defend in this debate. Their shift doesn't save them. For all of those reasons, the 9 PBs free us from the chains of inaction. Propose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. We would now like to invite the honorable opposition. Hear, hear.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. A strategic observation I'd like to make at the top of my speech today is that the proposition has 2 claims, right? First of all, they push that there are catastrophic problems that affect locals in the status quo. And the second thing that they said is that no one is doing anything about this because of our fixation on climate change. Note that this is contradictory, right? Because to the extent where there are extremely damaging local problems that exist in the status quo, then we think that that's exactly what the status quo looks like, right? It's not a fixation on climate change. We never said that, and we never supported a world where people actively push for solving climate change, right? We pushed for a world where people solve localized problems. That was never a concession that our LO made. Don't let them strawman our case, right? Second, it shows you that this is exactly why this is going to be the status quo, right? Because focusing on local problems is our comparative, whereas their comparative is having a global framework where everyone pushes for something like a collective goal together, right? That's exactly why under their side of the house, some countries will necessarily have their goals or have their demands go completely silenced under their side, right? Because when you have a collective goal, that necessarily means that certain individuals who do not identify with that goal, certain countries that do not have the same demands as this global collective push, will necessarily be left out under their side of the house, which exacerbates the problems of things like backlash and not being able to implement policies effectively under our side of the house, right? To the extent where these policies necessarily match with the local problems, then we think that in those instances aren't really part of the debate anyways, because it's symmetrical on either side of the house, right? They have to engage with a world where localized problems are not going to be solved under their side of the house, festering political backlash, festering ineffective policies under their side of the house, and that's exactly the harms that they have to take in today's debate. The first clash I want to talk about is on policy efficacy, right? What we told you was that the framework relies on faulty calculations and not told you that this means that, first of all, you don't have policies that can be implemented under their side of the house, and second, even when they do have policies that can be implemented, you have pushback from the political right because your ideology, it relies on a faulty framework that you can't actually even scientifically prove, right? And note that this flips their analysis about people not wanting to support in the status quo, right? Because to the extent where even though we have because we already have research on things like climate change, on things like carbon dioxide emissions, on things like rising sea levels or things like global temperatures, right? Because we already have that research, this is still comparatively better than on their side of the house where they have to restart everything again, right? It's necessarily comparatively more research than whatever research they want to use to back up their framework, and that's exactly why you have less buy-in and you have even more political backlash under their side of the house. This clashes directly with the first claim that they had, which was that climate change is not that catastrophic. Note that this claim is already out of this debate, right? Because it doesn't actually deal with the crux of our case, which was never to defend everyone pushing for climate change, right? Everyone pushed for their localized problems, which is exactly what we pushed for. This claim doesn't actually interact with our case. The second thing that they said was this concession that they made about how solving climate change benefits other boundaries, and therefore we don't actually have to prioritize things like climate change, right? But note that this actually concedes to our side of the house, right? Because we never actually pushed for defending things like climate change. We wanted a localized approach, which is only going to garner more political support on our side of the house. The third thing they said was on this idea of diversification on funding and research. I'll take you after this clash. First, right, they conceded themselves that this is a bad move because you necessarily have to throw out all the previous research that has already been done, right? They admitted themselves that there's already a lot of research going into things like carbon dioxide and rising global temperatures, right? That you necessarily have to throw this out for faulty calculations that would be replaced because of the planetary boundary framework being in its infancy stage, right? This second thing is that local research efforts are scrapped and replaced with international research that you can't actually that you can actually confirm, right? This necessarily means that political backlash is going to fester even more under their side of the house, right? When you have localized efforts being scrapped and replaced for international efforts that local people can't actually identify with. Third thing is that this loses them the debate because first of all, it wastes time restarting, right? Because under their side of the house, they can't have this idea of doing more research under their side of the house and correcting this framework as they go along, right? Because of the urgency, because of the nature of the urgency of the problem, right? They themselves wanted to talk about how things like on how environmentalism is already damaging so many people's lives, like in the status quo. This necessarily becomes worse under their side of the house because they have to restart all their research again, making their framework, their framing of urgency being the problem in their status quo even more harmful under their side of the house because they have even less research under their side of the house to begin with. The next thing that they said was that you can have policies even if you don't have full information, like for example the Paris Convention. But note that this is straw man because it doesn't actually engage with our analysis about people not believing in the policies and states not wanting to implement them in the first place because you can't actually justify these policies, right? It doesn't actually matter exactly what the numbers are on our side of the house because there's already a scientific consensus around that. But whereas on your side of the house, this consensus doesn't exist. Right, and also secondly, and the last thing that they said was that climate change will still have a disproportionate focus and can use was this kind of concession that they made about how climate change will still have a disproportionate focus under their side of the house, and then they can use the technology that remains. That this is a concession to our side of the house, right? Because that is the status quo, right? If it's true that, like they said, that there is a fixation on climate change, or that there's disproportionately more research in climate change, then we think that just essentially means that they wash out this debate because they don't actually want to do anything and they just want to remain the status quo and not actually change anything. Before I move on, sure.
So we seem to agree that we ought to solve the same problems and have the same goals. So what's wrong with formalizing this on an international level given that it gets more resources globally?
We never conceded that there are that everyone has the same concerns, right? That was our entire push, that people have localized concerns that they want to push for and we allow them to push for, meaning we get better policies, we get more political support under our side of the house. Second clash that I want to talk about on political buying, right? What we told you was that we have more political support because first of all, we focus on people's immediate needs, and second, we don't use ideological damaging framework that fuels skepticism from the right. This clashes directly with the first thing that they said about how people about their question about how people will have how backlash would exist if people don't actually know the problem, right? Because if it's unquantifiable, then this is exactly harmful under their side of the house, right? Because political leaders can get away with implementing policies that don't actually benefit people under their side of the house because it's unquantifiable, because you don't have complete research or as much research as in the status quo, right? Then that means then that their policies become even more ineffective under their side of the house because political leaders can get away with doing nothing under their side of the house. You can't hold them accountable because it's unquantifiable. The second thing that they say was that people don't lose hope under their side of the house because we've saved the ozone boundary before. Note that this is 1 out of 4 boundaries that we've already surpassed, right? Just like in terms of numbers itself, people are more likely to lose hope because there are many more boundaries that we've surpassed. There's so many that there are essentially many gaps that people have to fill up. People are not going to be motivated by that. But the second response is that we don't actually know that is comparatively better on our side of the house because we don't have thresholds that say that we're doomed once we pass them, right? People will continuously put in effort on our side of the house because there is no limit as to because we don't set a limit as to when the world will be destroyed under our side of the house. That's exactly why people will continue to put in effort under our side of the house. That's exactly why localized efforts will continue to benefit, to develop on our side of the house. The last thing I want to talk about is on this idea of minorities, right? Because this was their argument. But note that this argument isn't really in this debate at all because it's contingent on them proving, on their side being like that localized efforts are focused more under their side of the house, which isn't the case as I've proven before in my speech, right? Therefore, very proud to oppose.
We will now move on to reply speeches. So I will first invite the honorable reply speaker from the opposition side. Here.
Proposition was the team that wanted you to believe that you need information to hold policies accountable, but their own boundaries was the one that was unquantified. Proposition was the team that said that you need an accurate framework within the status quo, but because their DPM says it's in its infantile state, it's unclear as to why you're able to get the policies passed in their paradigm. What we consistently told you down the opposition bench was that this climate change issue was urgent, that you need to be able to solve it now, and restarting any form of progress is likely to lead to climate change catastrophe. I want to ask 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, is the framework accurate? Secondly, on diversity inclusion, and thirdly, on political support. Firstly, is the framework accurate? We started this debate from a very simple claim, that information in the status quo is not quantified like novel entities and atmospheric aerosol loading. This is not only harmful because you need to justify to your constituency, but to deal with the new material from third government, we told you it was horrible because you can't make decisions for policies in the first place. What policy, what a solution are you trying to provide to an issue that you yourself cannot even pinpoint in the first place? That's why being able to quantify things was important, and that's why they can't just get away with saying that, well, other things also exist. But they specifically says that, well, voters don't care about these issues. But firstly, this contradicts their own claim that voters ultimately care, so they have to choose one or the other. But secondly, at least there is something to show for your investment as a politician. And why is this really important? Because what we told you in first speaker that gets little to no engagement was that you're likely to be subjected to political short-termism on proposition. Because insofar you cannot show that you actually have progress, you're likely to be voted out because taxpayer thinks you're just wasting their money. But secondly, on the idea of research, because proposition cannot have all developed 9 boundaries in their side of the house because there's limited political capital, as we all agree in this debate. Under our side of the house, at the very least, we already have 1, a head start in the technological development that we have within the status quo, but 2, at the very least, we pivot to our resources to something that we can actually get into the long term. But this is important because insofar side proposition was to dwell on a failing solution, you also undercut the urgency of climate change into the long term. Because if you cannot fix all of these issues and your information is going to be inaccurate, that fuels the very same skepticisms that they themselves want to talk about. Secondly, on diversity in issues then, they gave us 2 claims here. 1, they say that infrastructures are done in horrible ways, and secondly, they say that you're not going to care about neglected areas. 2 problems. 1, we told you down the bench about political backlash, and the only response they give us the idea that you need to know that issues exist. But the problem in their side of the house is that these things are not quantified, and this is the involvement of our case that we told you down the bench, which is the idea that you're not able to hold your leaders accountable if you cannot pinpoint and say objectively that this policy is something is wrong, that's something that you cannot quantify. But the second response we told you is that it gets worse under their paradigm to no response, because politicians, if they're going to be bad actors, can say you You need to care about all of the 8 other boundaries in the status quo. You need to care about these issues, which is why you can sacrifice certain things to your quality of life into the long term. Their last thing was the idea on skepticism under their paradigm. But I think the skepticism gets worse because it's likely to be seen as an imposition of Western values in the long term. But even if you don't buy any of that, know how they don't engage with our extension in second speaker, which was that you're unlikely to get enforcement because countries care about their own local goals. They have local decentralized control. This is because there's no scientific instrument in the status quo that can cover every single country, which is why in their best case, even if policies are passed, an independent path to victory on the arse of the house is the fact that you're able to enforce policies that people actually care about. But thirdly, on political support, from first we told you under the fractionalization of goals that realistically nobody knows every single SDG goals under their paradigm. But even if that wasn't true, we told you at least we don't feel skepticism under our paradigm because the strongest claim from the right wing in the status quo is the idea that this type of issue doesn't matter to the average Joe. It's just an ideological thing that you're going off. Under arse of the house, when governments and institutions are able to say there's a local concern that we're able to target, that's when we're able to get political support. That's when we're able to get change under arse of the house.
When we tell debaters to evolve material down the bench, I think Op takes it a little bit too far. Because by the end of this speech, I am incredibly confused what they stand for. Let's take a look at the language that the 3 speakers have used. In Op 1, it was about limited capital, it was about climate, green technology. In Op 3, it became localized issues. But at the start of Op reply, guess what? They pivoted back to climate change. So I'm just incredibly confused what they really wanted to stand for. And I would note that this shifting around on the Op bench really just shows you how unclear they are with what they really stand for. But I want to call out a fundamental mischaracterization of what the prop case is. We told you clearly since first that when we adopt the 9 planetary boundaries framework, we don't need countries to solve all 9. Rather, you specialize and focus on the one individual issue that you can solve and the one individual issue that you are hurt by the most. If that's climate change, go ahead and solve it. But if it's chemical pollution, or if it's ocean acidification, then only our side lets you solve that, but opposition tells you that no, climate change is more important. So let's be clear. If a landlocked country is told that one of the 9 PBs is ocean acidification, of course it doesn't have to solve it because it has other more pressing issues to talk about. With that, 2 words in the speech. First on the word of the opposition, which was incredibly ineffective, and then on the word of the proposition, which was far more inclusive. Let's look at Op first, and here's where I want to evaluate the latest shift that comes out in the 3rd speaker. They say, we can care about these localized issues as well. But we told you that you actively are told on their side you cannot, because climate change is the most important, because status quo currently focuses the most on climate change. But if both sides have the same localized goals, and perhaps have the same issues that we want to solve like chemical pollution, we do it far better when we are discussed on a global scale. But I'm just not clear what's wrong with formalizing these issues on a global extent if it means that on our side, at least countries, for example, like Bangladesh, that need to solve pollution, can at least get help from other developed countries across the world that are also facing similar problems. On opposition, even if they agree that they want to solve these localized issues, you leave these countries alone because this is not a global thing that people are discussing. But is it even true that these are just simply localized issues? We told you that these issues often have far greater impact impacts. For example, the fact that ocean acidification often affects many different countries because guess what? Not just one country borders the ocean. So this proves to you that for a lot of these issues, we cannot solve them locally, but rather we need a global framework to discuss it properly. But at their best, even if they want to deal with one specific issue, it's far better on our side because at least you inform them of the 8 other things that may potentially be encroached on when they tunnel vision too much on one. So for example, when huge forest lands are deforested for solar farms to be constructed, what this shows you is that an over-focus on climate change often leads to hurt of the environment in the form of land system change. And that's the kind of trade-off that people will be forced to take on their side. But their silver bullet was on political backlash, but it's usually not enough for all the reasons that we gave to you in our speakers. We told you that backlash only happens with attention, we told you it's outweighed by the backlash of not doing anything about climate change, and we told you that all of this assumes that the problems immediately affect people, which they don't usually do. Let's take a look at the world of the proposition then. We told you that when we bring this on a global scale and allow people to specialize, that is a good thing because it means that people can now talk about things and do things that most affect their communities, and our second argument is incredibly important because it shows you that when they're comparative is countries that are not affected by climate change not doing anything about it. At least on our side, these countries are mobilized to solve other environmental issues that are incredibly important. So when China built the Three Gorges Dam, do you know how many people lost their livelihoods? It was 1.3 million people, and because people didn't know about the trade-offs, the opposition has to answer to the lives of these 1.3 million. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
All right, I thank the speakers for that fine speech and thank everyone for an excellent debate. Please cross the floor, shake hands, and then after that, if I could ask everyone to head out so that the panel can deliberate, that would be great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I heard you guys. Really?